Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Wednesday, December the 28th, 2022. We continue our look at the Christmas story according to the Gospel of Luke. You have to keep in mind here that there's four Gospels. John's Gospel and Mark's Gospel don't have a Christmas story, don't have anything about Jesus's birth. The prologue to John's Gospel, of course, has the beautiful, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But no specifics about how he came to be born. Matthew's gospel really, and we're going to maybe take a look at this later in the week, kind of picks up after Jesus is born. Talks a little bit about beforehand and the fact that Joseph was assured by the angel that this child was of the Holy Spirit and would be God's son and so forth. Luke's gospel is the only one that really tells the Christmas story, but maybe we've always looked at it in the wrong way. So, for instance, yesterday I shared something written by a fellow by the name of Jim Kane about all the busyness, people going from back to their ancestral homes to register for a census, and how busy it was in going. There was nowhere for them to stay, and they went to the inn, and there was no room, so they had to go into the stable. I mean, that's really kind of the Christmas story we grew up with. But we're going to take a little bit of a different look. And we started yesterday, that in those days, the decree went out for Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered, or that there would be a census. This was the first registration was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Talked about the fact that there's a little bit of a problem there. Quirinius doesn't become governor, we know, until 6 CE, whereas Herod died in 4 BCE. So there's a 10-year gap there. And in Matthew's story that we're actually going to be looking at this coming Sunday with the Magi and so forth, that Herod was living at the time of Jesus' birth. So there's a little bit of a problem there. New Testament scholar Frederick Danker, as I shared yesterday, kind of resolves this by, the fact that it talks about the first registration, that it would have taken some time to do that. To unfold. And so we talked about how this was a census, and unlike the censuses that are taken every 10 years in our country, this one wasn't for representation purposes. This was for taxation purposes. I mentioned the fact that the word here is for registration or census is apographo, which really means to kind of write your name. You had to kind of sign in, go to your town and sign in. Closest thing we have is, doing our tax returns every year, like making that connection with taxes. But here in verse 3, it gets a little interesting. And it simply says, all went to their own towns to be registered. Never noticed that before. We kind of skip ahead to the next verse, that Joseph went from Nazareth to the town of Bethlehem because he was from the house and family of David. But this would seem to indicate, presumably, that Joseph's hometown was actually Bethlehem, not Nazareth, where he appears to have been living at the time. And again, when Luke adds in verse 4 that Bethlehem was known as a city of David, therefore Joseph was descended from the house and family of David, we kind of just assume that he was being required to return to his ancestral home for tax purposes. But think about it. If the intent was to identify individual taxpayers as well as their property and wealth, it'd make no sense whatsoever for them to travel back to their ancestral homes. Rather, wouldn't you want them to register in the town where they actually lived and worked and owned property? Only makes sense, right? As Robert Cargill of the University of Iowa points out, it was anyone who, for whatever reason, was absent from his own hometown that was now required to go back home to register for tax purposes. We know that from a Roman governor some years later in Egypt who asked or who required people to do that. But here's the thing. So Joseph's hometown is Bethlehem. Mary, on the other hand, was apparently born in Nazareth, at least according to Luke 1, verse 26. You could look that up, which begs the question, if Mary was from Nazareth and Joseph was from Bethlehem, which was some 90 miles away, how did they meet and become engaged. Well, a hint is found in verse 139, Luke chapter 1, verse 39, where Mary, upon learning of her pregnancy, immediately went to visit her cousin Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea, which was presumably not all that far from Bethlehem, and perhaps an indication that she may have very well have traveled there before as well, and she may have met Joseph on one of those previous visits. On the other hand, Joseph's work as a carpenter or builder might have taken him up to Nazareth on a job or a project, in which case they might have met while he was living and working in Nazareth. Would certainly fit with the idea that apparently that's where he's living at the moment. Again, simply for tax purposes, was now being required to go home to register. Gets interesting. So if Joseph's from Bethlehem, but he's working in Nazareth and he meets Mary, however that happens, they become engaged, and now he has to go to register in Bethlehem. If it wasn't because he had to go for his ancestral home, what purpose would there have been, other than the fact that he had to go register, but to take Mary with him? Well, we're going to look at that tomorrow. So again, there's a registration. You got to go to your hometown. Joseph's got to go to Bethlehem. He's going to take Mary along. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Till then, take care. Bye.